Imagine walking into a room where someone is holding a remote control pointed directly at your chest. For months, maybe years, every time they push a button, you react. You get defensive. You try to explain yourself. You feel your pulse spike, your heart rate climb, and your voice pitch up. They press a button, and you perform. Now imagine the exact second that remote control stops working. You don't fight back. You don't raise your voice. You simply look at them with absolute unyielding calm. You see the exact moment they press the button, and nothing happens. No pulse spike, no emotional response, just dead air. What happens to the person holding that remote control? Most people think defeating a narcissist looks like a dramatic movie scene, a screaming confrontation where you lay out all their lies, back them into a corner, and they break down confessing their guilt. That is a fantasy. It never happens. In fact, if you're still yelling, arguing, or trying to convince them of how wrong they are still winning. You're still feeding the machine. Real defeat doesn't happen with a roar. It happens in silence. It happens when their psychological infrastructure experiences a catastrophic loss of control. When you defeat a narcissist for real, when you cut off their access to your emotional nervous system, their entire internal operating system experiences a silent crash. Because their constructed identity isn't real, it relies entirely on your reaction to stay alive. Without your emotional supply, the illusion shatters. But here's the dangerous part. A defeated narcissist doesn't just walk away quietly. They shift into a completely different behavioral baseline. They display 4 distinct, highly specific psychological markers. Involuntary shifts in their microexpressions, speech patterns, and tactical maneuvers that reveal they know, at a subconscious level, that it is over. If you miss these 4 signs, you risk stepping right back into their trap, just as you were about to break free. Pay very close attention to sign number 3 in particular, because if you mistake it for a sign of peace, you will leave yourself completely open to their most dangerous retaliation strategy. Let's break down the behavioral mechanics of what actually happens when you break their grip for good. When we analyze human behavior under psychological pressure, we look for indicators of stress, control, and baseline disruption. In a dynamic with a narcissistic personality, control isn't just a preference, it's oxygen. Their entire identity is built on an external stability framework. They manipulate your reactions to regulate their own fragile sense of self-worth. So, what happens when you dismantle that system? What does it actually look like when you defeat a narcissist for real? It's crucial to understand this. If you leave before hearing all 4 of these behavioral shifts, especially the subtle micro-expressions in sign number 2 and the tactical pivot in sign number 4, you will mistake their retreat for safety. You will misread their behavior, drop your boundary protocol, and allow them to re-establish leverage when they are at their most volatile. Here are the 4 undeniable signs that you have defeated a narcissist completely. The first sign of true defeat happens in the human nervous system. When a narcissist realizes their psychological leverage is gone, they experience what behavioral science calls an ego threat crisis. Their immediate response isn't a clever retook, it's an involuntary physical drop of their carefully curated persona. Watch their face closely during the moment of defeat. You will observe a distinct micro-expression pattern. Eye blink rate deceleration. Their blink rate will drop drastically as their brain shifts from persuasion mode to survival processing. Facial muscle atonia. The subtle practiced smile or smug mask instantly collapses. The muscles around the jaw and mouth go flat. The cold stare. They look directly at you not with anger, but with an eerie, analytical emptiness. They aren't assessing how to manipulate you anymore. They are registering that you are no longer readable or controllable. They stop trying to charm you, gaslight you, or provoke you. For a brief window, you are looking directly at the hollow core underneath the construct. Once the immediate shock wears off, their verbal baseline shifts. When a narcissist still thinks they can control you, their voice carries dynamic energy. It goes up in volume, shifts in cadence, and uses emotional inflection to pull you back into the argument. They want you upset. When they are defeated for real, their voice flattens into a monotone, low-pitch register. They move into absolute, cold disengagement. This isn't the silent treatment used as a tactic to punish you. This is psychological retreat. Their answers become terse, one-word responses. They avoid direct eye contact, looking past your shoulders or down at their hands. They cut off the emotional thread entirely. Why? Because human beings don't invest energy in systems that yield zero return. The moment your emotional circuit breaks, their brain cuts the feed to conserve psychological capital. This is where most people get caught off guard. When you strip a narcissist of internal control, they immediately pivot outward to secure external validation. They realize they cannot rewrite the narrative with you, so they rush to rewrite it for everyone else. Within hours or days of a true defeat, you will notice a rapid escalation in preemptive reputation management. They reach out to mutual acquaintances, family members, or colleagues. They adopt the role of the quiet, deeply concerned victim. They won't make wild, angry accusations. That looks unhinged. Instead, they will use soft concern. I'm just really worried about them. They've changed so much lately. They try to anchor the story first. Whomever controls the initial narrative controls the perception of the room. When you see them frantically building a protective wall of third-party sympathy, recognize it for what it is, an admission that they have lost all power over you directly. Most people trapped in these dynamics are familiar with hoovering, the cycle where the narcissist returns weeks or months later with promises of change, nostalgic references, or sudden emergencies to pull you back in. The final, definitive proof of true defeat is the complete extinction of hoovering behavior. A narcissist only hoovers when they believe there is residual emotional equity left to exploit. If they sense even 1% of doubt, guilt, or emotional attachment in you, they will keep testing the fence. When you defeat them for real, when your boundary is so absolute, flat, and immovable that attempting to manipulate you causes them psychological discomfort, they stop reaching out entirely. They don't hold a grudge. They don't try to check in on holidays. You become a dead zone on their map. You are no longer a source of supply. You are a reminder of their vulnerability. And a narcissist will avoid anything that reminds them of their own weakness at all costs. Defeating a narcissist isn't about getting revenge, getting the last word, or forcing them to apologize. You will never get an apology that isn't another manipulation. Real defeat is when you become entirely unmanipulatable. It's when their words, guilt trips, and provocations fall into a vacuum of your calm, unshakable clarity. When you notice these four signs, the dropped mask, the cold disengagement, the desperate narrative control, and the final permanent silence, understand what has happened. You didn't just win an argument, you took back the remote control. Keep it in your hands, maintain your boundaries, and never look back. When people set out to confront a narcissistic personality, they almost universally commit a fatal tactical error. They bring arguments to a fight that isn't built on logic. They enter the interaction armed with receipts, timeline evidence, screenshot records, and emotional appeals, believing that if they can just present a flawless case, the other person will have to acknowledge reality. That strategy fails every single time because a narcissist's operating system is not designed to process truth. It is designed to protect an artificial ego construct. You cannot out-reason someone whose entire psychological architecture depends on denying the baseline facts of the situation. Every word you speak in anger, every piece of evidence you present with emotional heat, serves only as operational supply. To them, your frustration proves that they still hold leverage over your internal state. They aren't listening to the content of your words, they are measuring the elevation of your heart rate, the pitch modulation in your vocal delivery, and the micro-expressions of panic flaring across your face. True defeat does not occur through verbal dominance, it occurs through mask disruption. The mask, that carefully calibrated public persona built to project absolute superiority and emotional invulnerability, is a highly fragile defensive shell. It requires constant external feedback to stay structural. When you stop reacting, stop explaining yourself, and stop trying to get them to see your perspective, you effectively sever the energy pipeline that keeps that mask intact. This is where the psychological mechanic shifts dramatically from offensive manipulation to internal structural failure. When you systematically strip away their ability to elicit an emotional baseline change in you, their central processing unit enters an immediate feedback loop. Watch what happens physically during this specific shift. When a narcissist realizes that their standard toolkit of gaslighting, guilt projection, or sudden aggression produces zero shift in your physiological state, you will witness a rapid sequence of nonverbal stress responses. Their blink rate, which normally stabilizes during dominant assertions, will suddenly decelerate or freeze entirely as their cognitive processing reallocates towards sudden threat assessment. The micromuscles surrounding their mouth, the subtle facial tone that maintains their practiced, smug demeanor, lose tension instantly. You are observing muscle atonia caused by an immediate surge of internal adrenaline that has nowhere to go. This collapse happens because the narcissist's false self operates on a principle of reflected validation. They do not possess an internal reservoir of stable self-worth, so they borrow yours by manipulating your reactions. When you withdraw that emotional capital entirely, the system starves. They cannot sustain the omnipotent narrative when the person across from them displays the emotional stillness of a stone wall. The sudden absence of your reaction creates an intense psychological vacuum. In response, their internal defensive systems overheat. They will briefly attempt escalating behaviors, stiffening their spinal alignment, broadening their stance, or applying an unblinking aggressive eye contact protocol in a final attempt to force a pulse spike out of you. When those tactical escalations land against absolute neutrality, the mask doesn't just slip, it shatters completely. The illusion requires two participants, the manipulator pressing the button and the target supplying the physiological surge. The moment you neutralize your autonomic nervous system, the control panel goes dead. Their entire psychological framework collapses inward because there is no secondary emotional payload left to absorb. They are left completely exposed to the raw, unedited void of their own internal emptiness. When evaluating human behavior under intense stress, the most reliable indicators are never found in macro actions like shouting or dramatic gestures. They are revealed in micro-behavioral shifts, the subtle, involuntary leakages of the central nervous system that occur when a subject loses internal control. When a narcissist reaches the threshold of genuine defeat, their failure is registered long before they ever open their mouth. The human body is an exquisite communicator of internal psychological collapse, and because the narcissist's false self requires immense energy to maintain, a breakdown in their control mechanism triggers immediate, quantifiable changes in their physical baseline. The first marker to analyze is the eye blink rate. Under normal conversational conditions, a human blinks between 15 and 20 times per minute. When an individual is actively engaging in high-level deception or attempting to exert dominance, that rate can shift. However, when a narcissist realizes that their psychological leverage has been completely neutralized, their cognitive load spikes exponentially. Their brain abruptly reallocates processing power from tactical charm or active gaslighting toward raw threat assessment. This massive internal shift results in a dramatic deceleration of their blink rate, often dropping down to single digits per minute. They freeze into an unblinking analytical stare. This is not the strong, confident eye contact of an alpha presence. It is the frozen posture of a predatory brain that has suddenly realized it is no longer at the top of the food chain, frantically processing a sudden loss of dominance. Simultaneously, you will observe subtle vocal tract modifications. Pitch control is regulated by the autonomic nervous system. When an individual feels in control, their vocal cords remain relaxed, producing a varied, dynamic cadence designed to influence and persuade. But as true defeat registers, the sudden surge of unmanaged stress causes involuntary microtension in the laryngeal muscles. This causes their vocal pitch to flatten into a tight, low-register monotone, or in some instances, to crack slightly under pressure. The cadence loses its rhythmic fluidity. Speech becomes abrupt, staccato, and clipped. They stop using expansive, persuasive language and drop to bare minimum linguistic output. They are no longer speaking to manipulate you. Their nervous system is actively shutting down unnecessary communicative channels to conserve remaining capital. Further indicators appear in posture alignment and spatial orientation. A narcissist seeking dominance occupies space aggressively, leaning forward, keeping their chest open, and using expansive hand gestures to anchor authority. The exact moment their psychological remote control stops working, their physical frame contracts. You will observe subtle postural shifts, shoulders rounding inward by a fraction of an inch, hands retreating toward the center of the body or sliding into pockets, and the chin dipping slightly to protect the neck. These are subconscious, hardwired mammalian defense responses to vulnerability. They may simultaneously break direct chest-to-chest orientation, turning their torso slightly away from you at a micro angle. This subtle pivot is a physical manifestation of psychological disengagement, their nervous system seeking an exit route from an interaction where it can no longer extract compliance. These involuntary indicators cannot be faked or easily suppressed because they bypass the conscious mind entirely. While the narcissist may attempt to maintain a demeanor of cold indifference or superior dismissiveness, their autonomic nervous system betrays the truth. The drop in blink frequency, the loss of vocal resonance, the muscle contraction in the face, and the micro-pivoting of the spine all point to a single internal event, the complete systemic failure of their psychological leverage. When a narcissist recognizes that their psychological control over you has been permanently severed, their behavioral strategy undergoes a swift, tactical shift from active engagement to abrupt emotional detachment. To the untrained observer, this sudden disengagement looks like a deliberate silent treatment designed to punish or manipulate. However, behavioral analysis reveals a far different reality. This is not a calculated maneuver. It is a defensive retreat driven by severe psychological depletion. When their emotional buttons no longer trigger a physiological reaction in you, the return on investment for their energy vanishes. A narcissist operates strictly on a principle of psychological return, and the moment your emotional circuit breaks, their system cuts the power to conserve whatever remains of their fragile ego. This cold disengagement manifests in very specific, measurable ways within the interaction dynamic. They cease all attempts to persuade, gaslight, or provoke you, shifting instantly into a flat, transactional communication mode. Their verbal responses collapse into brief, one-word answers delivered without emotional resonance or dynamic inflection. You will notice a complete absence of the dramatic flair, subtle sarcasm, or intense emotional appeals that previously characterized their communication style. If you ask a direct question, they respond with bare minimum information, keeping their answers cold, efficient, and completely devoid of personal warmth or hostility. They are no longer attempting to shape your perception. They are drawing a strict, impenetrable boundary to protect themselves from further exposure to their own powerlessness. Simultaneously, their nonverbal behavior shifts toward total spatial and visual avoidance. During active manipulation, a narcissist uses direct, intense eye contact to monitor your microexpressions and calibrate their tactics in real time. During abrupt disengagement, that eye contact disappears entirely. They look past your shoulders, stare down at a fixed point on the table, or focus intensely on an unrelated object or digital device. This visual disengagement is a protective mechanism designed to block any incoming behavioral feedback that might reinforce their sense of defeat. By breaking eye contact and removing themselves visually from the interaction, they attempt to create a psychological buffer, effectively pretending that the dynamic and your newly established immunity to their control does not exist. What makes this behavioral shift so distinct is the absolute drop in emotional heat. Unlike the silent treatment, which is usually accompanied by visible tension, deliberate huffing, aggressive body language, and lingering heavy energy meant to force you into apologizing, treat-driven disengagement is eerie, hollow, and completely flat. There is no underlying expectation that you will break the silence to soothe them, because their brain has already registered that you will not take the bait. They do not hold the space with dramatic indignation, they simply withdraw from it. They move around the room with minimal noise, avoid entering your immediate physical perimeter, and wrap up the interaction as quickly as possible without seeking a final word or dramatic exit. This sudden emotional retreat serves a dual purpose for the narcissist's threatened ego. First, it minimizes any further damage to their constructed persona by preventing additional failed manipulation attempts. Second, it allows them to immediately begin processing their internal narrative rewrite, framing their sudden exit as a conscious choice to remove themselves from an uncooperative or irrational target, rather than an involuntary retreat caused by their own loss of power. By flattening their emotional output and physically removing themselves from your influence, they attempt to salvage a hollow illusion of control, sealing themselves off in a sterile, silent vacuum where their fragile self-image remains unthreatened. When a narcissist loses internal control over you, their immediate tactical response is to pivot outward and execute a rapid, aggressive strategy known as narrative preemption. Because they have failed to rewrite reality directly within your dynamic, their psychological survival mechanism demands that they rewrite it for everyone else in your shared social or professional ecosystem. They understand, at a fundamental level, that whomever anchors the initial narrative controls the room's perception. The moment they recognize their leverage over you is completely broken, a timer starts in their head. They know they can no longer suppress your facts or silence your voice through direct intimidation, so they race to control the surrounding environment before you have the opportunity to speak. This strategy is not a haphazard, angry lash-out. It is a calculated, highly refined campaign of preventive reputation control. A defeated narcissist rarely launches wild, unhinged attacks against you to third parties, because screaming accusations make the accuser look unstable and unreliable. Instead, they adopt an extremely dangerous persona, the deeply concerned, quiet victim who is simply heartbroken by your sudden and unexplained behavior. They systematically target mutual acquaintances, family members, or colleagues, leaning into soft, performative empathy. They say things like, "I'm just really worried about them lately," or "I've tried everything to support them, but I don't know what's going on with their mental state." By framing the collapse of the dynamic around your supposed instability, they preemptively discredit anything you might say in the future before you even open your mouth. The mechanics of narrative preemption rely entirely on emotional manipulation of neutral parties. The narcissist leverages social norms and human empathy to build a protective wall of third-party sympathy around themselves. They present selective half-truths, weaponize confidential information you previously trusted them with, and subtly invert the roles of aggressor and victim. If you cut off contact with them, they do not tell people you set a boundary because of their mistreatment. They tell people you suddenly abandoned them out of nowhere. If you remain calm and composed during a confrontation, they tell third parties that you were cold, unfeeling, and sociopathic. Every boundary you enforce is reframed as an act of senseless cruelty, effectively weaponizing your independence against your reputation. This external smear campaign serves two primary psychological functions for the defeated narcissist. First, it provides them with immediate, alternative sources of emotional supply to replace the pipeline you just shut down. The sympathy, validation, and head nodding they receive from unwitting third parties help to rapidly patch the massive tear in their inflated ego construct. Second, it creates a secondary layer of pressure designed to force you back into line. They anticipate that the social fallout, the awkward looks from mutual friends, the unsolicited advice from family members, or the subtle shift in workplace dynamics will distress you so severely that you will break your boundary, re-engage with them, and try to set the record straight. Recognizing narrative preemption for what it truly is, a desperate defensive maneuver born out of total defeat, is crucial for maintaining your psychological ground. When you see a narcissist frantically reaching out to your circle, spreading quiet distortions, and securing allies, it is not a sign of their power or social dominance. It is an explicit, undeniable admission that they have lost all direct power over you. They are forced to operate in the shadows of your social circle precisely because they can no longer stand toe-to-toe with your boundary, your clarity, and your absolute refusal to play their game. The complete extinction of hoovering behavior represents the ultimate, irreversible confirmation that a narcissist's psychological grip on you has been shattered. To fully grasp the significance of this shift, one must understand that hoovering, the persistent, cyclical attempts to suck a target back into a toxic relationship dynamic, is not driven by love, nostalgia, or a genuine desire for reconciliation. It is a calculated testing of boundaries designed to probe for residual emotional equity. A narcissist continues to send benign check-in texts, drop subtle references to shared memories, create sudden personal emergencies, or orchestrate supposedly accidental encounters, only when their internal model calculates a remaining probability of success. They hoover because they believe there is still a crack in your armor, an unhealed vulnerability, or a lingering need for closure that can be exploited to reestablish control. When you defeat a narcissist for real, that predictive model undergoes a permanent structural revision. The absolute halt of hoovering occurs when your behavioral responses cross a threshold of unyielding flat neutrality, what behavioral scientists term the extinction baseline. In classic behavioral conditioning, when a reinforced behavior repeatedly yields zero reward, the subject eventually abandons the action entirely. When a narcissist attempts to engage you and receives neither defensive anger, emotional pleading, nor polite compliance, but rather an absolute, impenetrable wall of cold indifference, the psychological cost of the attempt instantly outweighs the potential reward. They realize that reaching out to you no longer yields emotional supply. Instead, it exposes them directly to the unbearable reality of their own irrelevance. This realization triggers an immediate behavioral shift from active persistence to complete avoidance. A defeated narcissist does not hold a quiet grudge while secretly hoping you will reach out. They systematically classify you as a dead zone within their operational map. Reaching out to a target who has achieved complete psychological immunity is inherently dangerous to the narcissist's fragile ego construct.